welcome back to the digestive system part number 2. Let's talk about some objectives for this video. We will discuss the anatomy and basic structures of the pharynx and the esophagus. We're going to discuss the process of swallowing, the structure and function of the stomach, how stomach acid fluids are secreted, and finally a discussion of accessory organs that are useful for digestion, like would be the liver and the pancreas. Let's begin the discussion about the pharynx and the esophagus. So the oropharynx and the laryngopharynx are passageways for food and water. The nasopharynx, we can find that if we go in through the nose, there would be an open space in there, and that would be the nasopharynx. The oropharynx have to do with mouth, so that would be the space right right behind where the mouth it's going to be. And continuing down, all of those passages connect one with the other. If we continue down in that cavity, we will find the laryngopharynx. The esophagus, it's a muscular tube that serves for the propulsion of food. So continuing down the laryngopharynx, that would be the esophagus, and it is made of a very muscular layer that will hold on to food and push it down all the way into the stomach. Let's have a closer look at that esophagus. The esophagus goes down from the cavities up top in the head. It will go down the chest. It will pierce the diaphragm. Let's remember that the diaphragm, it's the muscle that separates the thoracic and abdominal cavity. That esophagus would go back down, will pierce through the will pierce down the diaphragm at what it's called the esophageal hiatus. It joins the stomach in an area that it's called the cardial office. This area would be the cardial office, and the cardial office is surrounded by what it's called the cardial sphincter, which is this layer of muscle that can open and close to regulate the movement of materials going down there. It helps prevent the reflux of materials. Once again, let's remember that everything, or pretty much everything in the human body, will move in one direction, and normally we don't want things to move in the opposite direction. So the sphincters are going to do exactly that. They're going to prevent movement going in the opposite way. So this is where food is going to go down. It is going to go in through the mouth. Eventually it's going to go down the esophagus and all the way into the stomach. So let's have a closer look at the process of swallowing, or the anatomical word for the process of swallowing, which would be deglution. The process of deglution, we can separate it in two main phases. The first one of them is going to be the buccal phase. It's actually what happens in the mouth. And the pharyngeal phase, it's what happens before the food makes entrance into the esophagus. The very big difference between both of the phases of the process of swallowing, it's going to be the movement of this. Is it voluntary or isn't it voluntary? The buccal phase would be completely voluntary. This is what happens in the mouth. So whenever you are ready to swallow the food that you're eating, you will send a message to your brain. Your brain will interpret that, and it will come back down into the mouth, and the process of deglution can start. And once the food makes it all the way into the laryngopharynx, then the process is going to be completely automatic and regulated by the brain. So the buccal phase would be voluntary, and the pharyngeal phase would be involuntary. So let's have a look at the illustrations that we have to understand better the process of swallowing. Whenever we are ready for pushing the food down into the stomach, we are going to find that the esophageal sphincter, it's going to be closed, and this sphincter is located pretty much in the area of the neck. So this is the first entrance that will block food from going down there. Two very important structures in the process of swallowing are going to be the glottis and the epiglottis. The glottis and the epiglottis are membranous structures that can open or close the trachea or the esophagus depending on the material that it's being ingested. If it's air, then both of these membranes will reconfigure, allowing passage of air down into the trachea, which will eventually go into the lungs. But if now we are talking about swallowing, then both of those membranes are going to have a special arrangement that will block the trachea, and then the food is going to go down the esophagus. Because we all know what happens when we don't swallow things right and they go down the wrong pipe, like the common phrase says. We automatically start coughing because it's not something normal. Nothing should go into the lungs that it's not air. So the glottis and epiglottis are going to have this very special function of diverting these materials to the proper places. So at the beginning of the process, the esophageal sphincter will be closed. The process of deglution in the buccal phase is going to start. The reflex for swallowing is going to go in, and food will be located around this area right in there. Let's move this back again because everything is kind of like going away. So here we are one more time. So what happens? The glottis is going to move upward and it's going to close. The glottis is the one that it diverts things into the trachea, so we want that closed. So the glottis is going to close. The uvula is going to raise close in the nasopharynx area, and the uvula would be located around there. So it will raise, it will block this area so that food doesn't go back up our nose. So also the uvula is going to be there directing traffic of the materials that are going in. The glottis moves up and it closes, and finally the epiglottis blocks the trachea completely so that food would not go into the trachea. Then what is going to happen is that the esophageal sphincter is going to open. Remember that this is closed at the beginning of everything. So it is going to open. Food is going to go down in there. The waves of peristalsis now are going to kick in. And this is pretty much like squeezing a tube of toothpaste. Kind of like the action of the peristalsis. How is that going to work? So the waves of peristalsis are going to push the food down, both with contraction and relaxation, and the food is going to make it all the way into the cardial office, where I'm going to find another sphincter there controlling the passage. That is where the lower esophageal sphincter is going to be. So this sphincter is going to open whenever the stomach is ready for receiving this food, and that new bolus or that mixture of nutrients is going down into the stomach. So as you can see, it's very regulated, the process that we have here. Three main players that kind of direct the traffic of the bolus whenever it's being ingested and whenever it's going to be propulsed down into the stomach, and those would be the glottis, epiglottis, and the uvula. Let's remember that the glottis and epiglottis, their function is to block the trachea whenever solids are coming down, and the uvula, it's to block the nasopharyngeal cavity so that food doesn't go up our nose. So that is pretty much what happens every single time when we try to swallow something. Now let's have a closer look at the basic anatomy of the stomach. Let's look at this little interesting bag, kind of like something a little bit bigger there in the stomach. It's where this is I think it's one of the most famous organs that we have in the human body. So let's get to know it a little bit more. So a couple things that we should know about the stomach. It's the word chyme first than anything. Chyme, it's what the bolus is going to become after it reaches the stomach. And chyme would be a paste converted from food. Remember that in mechanical breakdown, I chew on the food, I mix it with saliva, and it forms a bolus, which is pretty much semi-solid. And when it gets to the stomach, the movement of the stomach and the juices, the stomach juices that are in the stomach, are going to transform now this bolus into a paste, which is a lot smoother and a lot easier for the GI tract to work with along the way. The cardial part is the entry point of the stomach. So here we have the entry point of the stomach, that is the cardial area. I have three main parts on the stomach. I have the body, I have the fundus, as well as the pyloric part. The body of the stomach would be the largest area right in the center of the organ. The fundus, it would be the superior part of the stomach, whilst the pyloric area would be the very end of the stomach. Okay? So the fundus would be that dome of the stomach, mid portion, pyloric part at the end here, and one very important sphincter that is very famous, and we have to remember the name of this. It's the pyloric sphincter. And the pyloric sphincter, it's the muscle mass that will control the passage of food from the stomach into the duodenum, or the very first part of the small intestine. So the food will remain in the stomach for a little while. It will get mixed with the stomach juices. It will take the chemical breakdown that it's necessary then for the rest of our digestive process, which would be the absorption of the materials. Up to this point, what we have done with food when it's going in the process of digestion, it's first than anything, break it down into smaller pieces, and now the stomach is just going to break this down furthermore using acids to break these large molecules into smaller chunks of molecules, to break it down into glucose, proteins, amino acids, and fats. Very important that no absorption it's happening through the stomach. The stomach, it's an organ that its main job is to further down break the food. Not yet have we done the digestive process completely. As of now, we're still breaking down. We're still breaking down the food. So a couple of cells are very important in talking about the stomach. This is a combination of cells. So we're basically talking about the tissues. In the microanatomy of the stomach, we're talking about the tissues that make up the stomach. So let's have a look at the cells so that we understand the functionings of the stomach a little bit better. Let's start with mucus cells. Mucus cells, just like the name suggests, produces acidic mucus, and this acidic mucus aids in the breaking down of the particles or the food, the bolus that it's coming down in the stomach. Those mucus cells, if we look at our image here to the right, these cells are going to be those mucus cells, and we can see gastric pits, and this is just openings to the inner linings of the stomach, and whenever these mucus cells produce the mucus, the acidic mucus, it will be secreted into this space, and then it will make its way up all the way into the surface of the stomach. I have there parietal cells, and the parietal cells are pretty much, we can say, the main players of this. The parietal cells secrete the hydrochloric acid, or the stomach acid, if we want to call it by a common name. Parietal cells are a little bit deeper into the tissues of the stomach, and they contain what it's called microvilli, which is like little hairs on the surface of the cells, and they produce something very important for digestion, and that is going to be the intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor, it's a special kind of messenger that aids in the absorption of vitamin B12. So those parietal cells have two main functions. One of them is to produce the HCl, and HCl is the stomach acid, the scientific name or the chemical name for stomach acid, and that intrinsic factor, which is very important in the absorption of B12 later on in the process. Another type of cell that we have is chief cells. These cells produce pepsin. Pepsin is a very important digestive enzyme, and we'll talk about this enzyme a little bit later. Also produces lipases that have to do with the breakage of lipids, very important in the stomach as well. So if we want to locate those chief cells, they're even deeper into those gastric pits, into the layers that make up the stomach. Finally, I have the enteroendocrine cells, and they produce gastrin, which is another enzyme, and gastrin has a special function of regulating the secretion of the parietal cells, making the stomach juice and the motility of materials down the digestive tract. So looking at these four cells and what the stomach is going to do, it's very important that we remember them. Where are they? What is their function? Because by knowing the function of the cells that make the layers or the tissues of the stomach, it gives us a more of a clear image on what are we studying the stomach. So just by analyzing these cells right here, the main function of the stomach is to produce these gastric juices. And by the normal peristaltic movement of the stomach, mixing these materials, these nutrients that are going down in the stomach, that's pretty much the function of the stomach. I make the gastric juices, and then I break down the food, I mix it together, and I prepare this food for the next step, which will be later on the absorption of all of these materials. So the body takes a lot of time. It takes a really, really long time to kind of like prepare those nutrients for the active process of absorption a little bit later. Let's talk a little bit more about this digestive process. The stomach serves as a storage place for undigested food, so food stays there for a certain amount of time, doing this peristaltic movement, this wave movement of mixing the food with the acid. It serves pretty much as a demolition structure, both chemically and mechanically as well. The acid in the stomach denatures the protein contained in food. That means changing their shape or breaking down the chemical bonds that hold the proteins together. Very important. The stomach, it's not an organ for absorption. Absorption is going to be performed by another organ a little bit later down, but the stomach's job is to break down the food and temporarily store the food in there because the small intestine can't handle a lot of food at the same time. The only thing that it's absorbed through the stomach would be alcohol and aspirin. Okay, it's the only thing that can pass through the membranes of the stomach and get all the way into the blood. The only essential function, and look how interesting this is, the only essential function of the stomach is the secretion of that intrinsic factor. So in other words, you will be able to survive without a stomach, counting that you would have an artificial intake of intrinsic factor because it's necessary for B12, for vitamin B12. And if you're wondering what this B12 is for, B12 regulates the production of erythrocytes, and those are red blood cells, right? For red blood cells. So pretty much the stomach, even though it's a very important organ, very famous, everybody knows the stomach, but as it happens to be, it's not completely an essential organ. The stomach can be removed and a person can still survive with limitations, of course. The stomach, it's not a luxury in the body, but it's not incredibly fundamental, with the exception of the production of that intrinsic factor that has to do with blood production later down the road. So here we have a little bit of chemistry going on. Now we're kind of like giving a brief look at how is this HCl secretion, if we want to see things a little bit more chemically and to the atomic level. Well, what happens is atoms of bicarbonate, they break down in the presence of CO2. I have special enzymes in there that are called ATPase pumps, and those create a change in acidity, bring in the materials that are needed by the cell, pretty much to produce this fluid. What I want you to see about this process pretty much is that there is the presence of water in here, and always stress the importance of water in every kind of biological process because it stresses a lot the importance of water in living things. From ions, bicarbonate, from water, through special enzymes in the cells, chemical processes are going to occur, and both components are going to be created. Hydrogen ions, chloride ions, they join together, and that's how HCl is formed. We don't really want to go into a lot of depth about the production of this acid, but I just want you to have an idea that water is important in the production of that secretion, that electrolytes are also very important on this, and that there is a chemical balance going on to produce these HCl secretions. So let's talk a little bit how now things move in the stomach, and a couple names of what happens inside of the stomach. 3 things are going to happen in there in the process of emptying the stomach: propulsion, grinding, and retropropulsion. Let's just a self-description of how materials move inside the stomach. Let's talk about propulsion. Propulsion, it's the peristaltic movement will move chyme from the fundus down to the pylorus, or in other words, from the top into the bottom. So this contractions, and here we have kind of like a demonstration of those contractions. They're going to push food all the way up into the top of the stomach, and then the stomach relaxes, and that makes the food go back down into what the pylorus area is, which is pretty much the end of the stomach. So in other words, and if you want to visualize this as something common from our house, it will be similar to a washing machine, moving things to side to side, up and down. Number 2 is the grinding. The pyloric end acts as a pump, sending food into the duodenum. So this is like a little door that I have in the stomach, and whenever the food is coming down through propulsion, the pyloric sphincter opens up a little bit and just lets a little bit of that chyme move into the duodenum. The stomach, the duodenum, the small intestine, cannot manage well large amounts of chyme at the same time. So the stomach and those sphincters are going to control that movement. Number three would be the retropropulsion. Peristalsis causes the valve to close, sending the contents back into the stomach. So you can imagine this food. I think this is how I see it in my mind. Those contractions push the chyme up, then it relaxes and it comes back down. The sphincter opens up a little tiny bit, so a little bit of that chyme goes in. It closes and it pushes the food again, and it maintains that chyme moving constantly in the stomach for some time. Kind of like really interesting how really is it that the stomach happens. And whenever you have food in your stomach, you can lay down, you can put your arms in your stomach, and you can feel this peristaltic movements of that food inside of the stomach. Accessory structures of digestion. The liver, without a doubt, is one of the most important ones to discuss. So let's say a couple things about this liver. The liver is the largest gland in the human body. It's really, really, really a big gland in the human body. The liver is protected by the rib cage almost completely. So here we can have a picture. In the picture, we can see where the liver is located in relation to the thoracic cavity. So if you find the very tip of your sternum, your xiphoid process, behind that xiphoid process, there is where your liver is going to be located. The liver is composed of four lobes, the right and left lobes that I can see when I look at the liver from an anterior view. Here we have an anterior view. Right lobe is the largest lobe. Left lobe, lot smaller, about half the size of the right lobe. And the caudate and quadrate lobes are visible posteriorly on the liver. So we would have to look on the back to be able to see those lobes. The main function of the liver is to produce bile. So that would be a very important function of this liver. Talking about other accessories of the liver, we have the falciform ligament, which pretty much separates the left and the right lobe. So if we look at the anterior view of the liver, here I have my left, here I have my right, and going down from there, it's that ligament, the falciform ligament. I'm sorry, I should point just at this area here. The round ligament would be the inferior edge of the falciform ligament. So if we keep going down from that ligament that separates both of them, this little hanging piece of ligament would be that round ligament. Porta hepatis, it's considered the gateway of the liver. So if we look at this posteriorly, pretty much medial in the very center of the liver, we have this combination of a lot of things that are going into the liver. This is kind of like the gateway or the door or the gate for many things to go into the liver, specifically blood vessels that would bring in nutrients that will take out waste from the liver. We can find there the hepatic artery, the hepatic portal vein, the common hepatic duct where the bile is going to move, all the way into the gallbladder. So, what is in bile? Bile is a yellow-green alkaline solution. It contains things like bile pigments, cholesterol, triglycerides, phospholipids, electrolytes, kind of like a very big combination of different things. Only bile salts and phospholipids are actually the structures in bile that would aid in digestion. Specifically, bile salts aid in the absorption of that food in the stomach. So, because nutrients move through diffusion from the GI tract into the blood, it's very important that I have something salty that will change the concentration of solute in there to promote this osmosis or this diffusion to happen from the GI tract into the blood. And that is the big, big function of this bile. So if we look at the digestive functions of the liver, because the liver would have of course, other functions, but just in digestion, bile, would be the important thing, it has to do with the absorption of those nutrients from the GI tract into the blood. Bilirubin, it's another very important concept. It's the waste product of erythrocytes, and erythrocytes are red blood cells. Red blood cells, eventually they're circulating through the blood, eventually they get damaged, they get old, so they die, they break down, most of their components are reabsorbed and recycled, but whatever it's not recycled from the blood, it's It's one of the components of this bilirubin. The iron components are recycled, but bilirubin is excreted to the blood. Stercobilin, which is one of these components of bilirubin, it's actually what gives stool its brown color. So part of the waste of the body that we mentioned before, undigested food, it's not the only thing that it's eliminated through defecation in this system, but also the remnants or whatever I cannot reuse from my blood. And stercobilin would be that particular pigment that gives stool its color brown. So now that we're talking about the liver, I think that would be important to talk about hepatitis and what is hepatitis. Anything that ends in itis, it's considered an inflammation. So hepatitis is an inflammation of the liver, often caused by viral infections like the hepatitis C virus, for example. Other non-viral conditions that are associated with the liver, with drug-induced toxicity and mushroom poisoning, those are things that can also cause hepatitis. Another very, very, very considerable conditions, the non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, that affects about 30% of people and 70% of obese people. And this has to do with an abnormal lipid metabolism. When there is something wrong in the absorption of fats, it turns the liver into fatty tissue. There is an enormous accumulation of fat into this liver. Cirrhosis, it's known as the chronic inflammation of the liver, and what happens in here is that the cells of the liver start to break and die, and then they are replaced with scar tissue. In scar tissue, it's not specific as regular, healthy liver cells are, so the liver pretty much loses its function. Let's talk about the gallbladder for just a quick second. The gallbladder, like we mentioned before, is a storage site for bile. Whatever bile is not used right away, the liver keeps producing this bile. The bile gets accumulated in the gallbladder, and that ensures that there is a constant stream of this bile being deposited into the small intestine to aid with the absorption. It concentrates the bile by removing water, so I have like a very, very thick, very dense bile liquid, and then whenever it's needed, it's combined with water once again, and it goes into its more liquid form, and it's deposited into the small intestine. Here in this picture, we have a better view of what's happening. Here. This is the porta hepatis of the liver, and this through this green tubes is where the bile is being collected, and whatever bile is not needed at the time goes into the gallbladder where it gets condensed. This is the common bile duct, which is the connection point between the small intestine that we have over here and the bile that it's being deposited there. And remember that this is the process of absorption in the stomach. So now we've kind of like gave a preview of what is the main organ of this digestive system. Who does the absorption of all of these materials? Well, we'll get there. That it would be the small intestine. Talking about the pancreas, another very important accessory organ of the digestive process, the pancreas produces enzymes that break down all types of food components. Talking about important, who promotes the chemical breakdown of or the final breakdown of fluid of this material, of these things that we eat that we call food. Who provides that aid on finally breaking it down like I want it to? The pancreas is going to be the organ that it's doing this. The pancreas contains endocrine and exocrine components. The exocrine part of the pancreas is what actually creates the pancreatic juice. And what can I find in the pancreatic juice? I'm going to find a lot of enzymes that will break every single type of food. I'm going to find proteases. Proteases sounds like proteins, so those are enzymes that break down proteins into amino acids. Amylase, the same enzyme that I can find in the mouth, it's also produced by the liver, and amylase breaks starch, and starch is like a large sugar, pretty much what would be in bread, in potatoes, in pasta, kind of like things like that. Lipases break down fats, and nucleases break down nucleic acids. So now in the small intestine, the final breakdown, the final chemical breakdown can actually occur, and these smaller fundamental molecules could more easily be absorbed thanks to the action of that bile that is produced by the pancreas. The bile duct and the pancreatic duct unite in the wall of the duodenum. So here we have the duodenum. There is where they join up together. So there is a very close relationship with the pancreas and the liver. The hepatopancreatic ampulla, it's a bowl-like structure, or in other words, the fusion of the ducts. So if we want to give that a very anatomical name, it's the hepatopancreatic ampulla. And at the hepatopancreatic sphincter, this is in the small intestine. This is a combination of muscles that can open and close to control the flow of the secretion both from the liver and the pancreas as well. Control mechanism after control mechanism after control mechanism to ensure a very, very regulated process. Okay, so we discussed the stomach in a lot of detail today. We discussed how these gastric juices are actually produced, how food moves inside of the stomach, how food gets to the stomach all the way, and some of those accessory organs that are, even though we call them accessory organs, but they are fundamental for the process of digestion, like would be the production of bile and pancreatic juice, which gives me those final touches on breaking down chemically that food that I eat so that it can later on be absorbed by the small intestine. So in the next video, we will conclude with the rest of the information for this digestive system. Thank you for your attention, and I will see you on the next one.